Okay, so welcome to our second series in the In-Depth series. This one on creation care, on environmental stewardship, on environmentalism in general, and how we got to this stage in our world and in our church, with a particular look at the different factors that have led us here. And I am deeply indebted for this to a guy named Howard Schneider, who I think has put together some really important work on this that has taken it to a new level, and as you'll see, it needed to go there. The way that the church thought about stewardship, environmental stewardship, was lackluster over a large portion of recent history, and wasn't fully making enough out of what the gospel says about our duty to creation. You heard my sermon today, so you kind of have a sense of my feelings on the matter anyway, but my thesis for this week, like last one, is that our duty to creation is expressed in its highest form when we talk about it as a matter of gospel, not merely as a matter of law. And that changes entirely what our responsibilities and our hopes are when we locate it in the sense of gospel. So, a little bit of background. Environmentalism as a movement is realistically ancient, but also can't be traced the way that you can trace like other philosophical movements. Some people would say that many ancient peoples, including some ancient peoples in Persia, that had a lot of would actually willingly go to war over certain ecological things, might have been considered the first environmentalists. The roots of the environmental movement, as Greenpeace tracks them, don't involve so many people that are like notorious thinkers so much as they involve people who are notorious doers, like John Muir, who was famously a close friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and for which Muir Woods, where the largest tree in the world is located, is named. He and people like Teddy Roosevelt, who are conservationists, are kind of all part and parcel of this big movement that, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, began to see that there was a particular modern need for an environmental movement. This is pretty clear because other people at the same time were talking about the power of modernity to really rattle natural systems. Updike was talking at this point in time about how the meatpacking industry had a way of being so thoroughly modern and disruptive that it was destroying people's sanitary conditions, for instance. So already there was a lot of people saying, okay, maybe modernity, maybe the gifts given to us from technology and industrialization in particular aren't just 100% good. Maybe they're trade-offs. And so it's good to have a textile mill. Maybe it's not good for the water to have a textile mill in our city. This has been a very, very gradual growth, though. I mean, people in all these forms always faced a lot of pushback, and we don't oftentimes remember that. But everyone from Teddy Roosevelt on up who made important strides in environmentalism were met by a real backlash of people who called them, alarmists, and who claimed that their actions weren't being done in good faith, but they had some sort of ulterior motive. And there's a number of different reasons why. It almost always came down to money, and the fact that there was resources to be exploited that would then be protected. If things became natural parks, there would be a new way to have to do business if water standards were taken into account. This probably reached its most tragic conclusion when, in the 1970s, ExxonMobil formed a study committee to look into these claims that had existed since the early 1900s, that perhaps burning fossil fuels contributed to a uptick in temperatures as a result of of it not allowing sunlight, of the vapors to not allow sunlight again to leave the atmosphere, meaning that we would gradually over time start to accumulate a heat wealth. And what they found after canvassing all these scientists was that indeed that was the case. And it almost seems naive to us in the 2010s, almost 2020, to think that an oil company would even want to know what the results of that were. But in a pre-1970s sense, a company that had a shareholder stake and had people who were asking them, what's going on here, they wanted to know, will my investment in your company be a good long-term investment? Or is it going to be the case that ultimately me buying shares and stock of ExxonMobil is going to be a good short-term investment with bad long-term consequences? Maybe that's because they thought that global warming was going to damage the environment, or at the very least they thought that the government was going to do something about that and tax it at a rate where then it wouldn't be a good investment. In any case, and whether it's for at the behest of the stockholders or whether it was simply done anything else, ExxonMobil buried that result. And that really is the kind of key turning point in which it appeared that an unregulated sort of capitalism was going to be the enemy of environmentalism. And that back and forth has been the fight really ever since on the civil side. Now, it just so happens that in America, churches tend to have allegiances with political parties and with political agendas. And that's just a simple truth. We have to accept that that's the fact. And the fault line that exists in American politics around environmentalism basically saw itself play out exactly the same way in the church and in the church theology as it regards creation care and environmentalism too. But nevertheless, I think there's probably also some legitimate arguments that were being had, some substantial arguments about what is our duty to creation. How are we supposed to care for God's creatures? Who gets to set the rankings, right? If humankind is considered this important, and animals this important, and plants this important, then that guides our policy agenda. That means sort of how much you need to give and take, how much finance and unregulated commerce is going to take place. And if you put those things at a different level, perhaps even an equal level, you come up with an entirely different set of standards. In any event, it is also clear that this is not entirely a theological debate, because it doesn't take that long at looking at some of the arguments before you realize that they're arguments of convenience, and that some, it's really especially on the side of that argues against care for creation, are just picking up whatever argument is useful in the moment, and that they're oftentimes filled with red herrings or straw man arguments, and just they don't hold water. So how do we get from where we are today, where depending on how you characterize it, both sides of these things have a way of talking about one another that makes them completely demonized? On one hand, the right has a way of talking about it as here's the two sides. On one side, you have pantheists, people who believe that everything is God. This is their telling of the left, and the pantheist believes that humankind is just as sacred as a deer is sacred, as a blade of grass is sacred, and as a result, their policy, while it's founded around care for creation, is not actually a Christian one, is their argument. They don't take into account the divinity that is particular to humankind, or the fact that actually we were created to rule over nature. And so they would say that their side is one that takes most seriously care for creation. While on the other side of those things, the left would say we're the side that understands that creation is made holy, that we are all holy, and fundamentally what is happening on the other side of the aisle here is that a group of people have bought into the commodification and the objectification of things so much that now they see the entire world as something that can be exploited and used, all to their own end. And that furthermore, they have, through a number of sort of modernist theologies, including premillennial beliefs and tribulationism, have actually come to see the spirit and matter as being completely separate. So it doesn't matter what happens to this world, we're going to be raptured out of it, is the essence of that belief. Probably the most troubling thing about both of these sides having these arguments right now is that there's some truth to both of their claims about one another. And so for a long time, I think people have looked for a path forward that takes seriously the good points, but also the critiques that both have had against one another, while at the same time incorporating into it an urgency of mission that says that we have to solve this now in the way that we think about it, because the time to act was yesterday, while we were still arguing about whether we're in charge of nature or nature is in charge of us. It's becoming clear that both no one's leading and the earth is crumbling. So perhaps both are true and require our necessary action right now. How do we get to the spot where we had those two, this very tough dichotomy? This guy who I'm going to quote for you here, again, Snyder, he talks about 7, I believe. 7, no, these are 4 distorted views. Yes, here we go. 7 different things that led to the evangelical worldview. 7 things that we brought with us. So initially, I talked about the idea of spirit and matter being different. That argument in Christianity is as old as Christianity itself was. The very first beliefs about matter and spirit have absolutely nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible. They are imports from Greek philosophy. And in order for Greek philosophy and the Greek speakers to make sense of the gospel, one of the first things that we had to do was to talk in Greek terms so that it would be understood to a Greek-speaking audience, Greek being the lingua franca, really, of much of the world. Hey, Karin, come on in.
Sorry, Mike.
No problem. And as a result, we get things like the first creeds, right? The Nicene Creed, which uses all sorts of terms that you sort of wonder, I wonder why they use those terms. I didn't see any of them in the gospel, like homoousios, of one nature, of substance, all the same. What they're trying to do is to talk about this in a worldview that the Greeks believed really was split into the spirit of a thing and the matter of a thing. As that is a little bit of a problematic way of thinking about it, we'll see how that develops over time. The second one he talks about is Enlightenment rationalism. This is kind of the way that thought of spirit being distinct from matter gets developed into Enlightenment thought. This is, a high Enlightenment being really around the time that America's founded. The subject and the object are split. This is kind of the foundation of modern science, too. So if you are a subject, you are capable of viewing an object. Now that you've considered it an object, you know what it is, and you're able to dissect it and understand it better. A subject comprehending that an object is also a subject is what eluded the Enlightenment thinkers, because you can't fully ever understand another subject. They have their own interior lives, just like you do. And that doesn't allow room for the complete understandability of something. But it also demeaned nature, right? If you think that all of nature is comprised of objects and that it's fundamentally understandable, you've taken the spiritual out of nature entirely, out of the world we're living in.
So object would be something that's not alive, and a subject would be something that possibly is alive.
Not in the strict grammatical sense, but that's definitely the subtext of it, yes. That I think we'll put it this way. If you were to dissect every atom and separate it out and look at it that made up a living creature, would any of those atoms be alive?
Technically, yes, but they're not.
They would be alive as a whole,
Right.
but not alive as component objects. And that's ultimately the problem with the subject-object split, is that the point in between where that thing is its own subject and alive can't be understood in that sense. And if it can't at least be respected, then you start to build systems that aren't helpful, that think of things as objects. Incidentally, by the way, this is the roots of a lot of mankind's evil to one another too, is that through systems like racism, we saw people, huge groups of people, as objects to be acted upon, as opposed to subjects that had their own will and right to live and express themselves. And that way, people who did those awful things could actually sleep pretty well at night because they didn't think they were doing it to a subject. They thought they were doing it to an object. Enlightenment rationalism opened up the Industrial Revolution, which opened up wealth in nations, which opened up laissez-faire capitalism. And as Adam Smith describes when he writes about capitalism that comes out of this sense, it functions at its best when it is unregulated. When people are allowed to do whatever they want to, then the will of the market itself produces the best possible product.
I think everyone goes to church.
Because that is the deep truth about that, though, is that ultimately laissez-faire capitalism changes who you are. You end up worshiping at its altar, and we should begin to see at this point in time to some of the modern evangelical worldview that has made these component parts critical to its belief structure. Even if it claims to be entirely biblical, there's a lot of faith and hope that gets placed in each and every one of these systems. Ultimately, this is one of the ones that's most important, is around laissez-faire capitalism. You'll hear a lot online or in these circles, or people who are trying to dismantle environmentalism within the Christian sphere, and especially the Christian left sphere. They will say that it is immoral to lift up environmental grounds. And the reason why it's immoral is because it harms the functioning of the market. It steps into the market in a way that subverts it. And that means that the poor are cut off from their chances to do better in life, which is the promise of laissez-faire capitalism, that you can, through hard work, move up the ladder. I remember when I first encountered the idea that it was just laid out to me when somebody says, well, environmentalism is fundamentally anti-poor. I thought to myself, huh? Because it certainly seems to me like the people who suffer the most from harmed environments live in the global south. They live in places that climate change affects at a very high rate. They have less recourse to move themselves, their families, to put sandbags up when it floods. And they receive less in resources after it happens, whether it's globally or domestically. It seems strange to me that protecting the environment should affect them in this way, until you realize that the person you're talking to has a deep and abiding belief that the market itself is an engine for hope, and that it can deliver people from their problems.
I hear about this debate how you can fix it. If you can fix it, for example, increasing the taxes for the oil. So that means the oil will be expensive, obviously. So if you want to send food to some place, now it's more expensive. So to buy food is more expensive. So if that is more expensive for the people who has less money, it's more expensive for them. So if these people live so far from here, that you said live, I don't know, in really poor places where the child don't want to go to, many of them, because there are not a lot of money, now it will be more expensive to go to these places to bring food for them. So in this way, that can be inconvenient.
Let me tell you. Let me repeat back to you what I think you said, and tell me if this is correct. That there's an argument out there that if you provide assistance to certain markets so regularly, it will actually set up a dependency cycle that makes it even tougher for people to do their own commerce within that system. Is that no?
I mean, if you increase the taxes for the oil.
Yeah. Oh, tax. Okay. If you tax oil, sorry, I didn't understand that part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now to bring food or bring everything.
Oh, I get what you're saying.
Other people,
Right.
Yes.
because it's highest.
Right.
Before.
Yeah.
So we can find a way to help everyone and the environment, because that's the Bible commands when God said when He created us. Yeah.
Yeah.
But without harm.
Yeah. Exactly right.
The other part of the society. So I think independence what believe the people, if you are left or right, because left they wanna really help the society. And
Yeah.
the right, I think too.
I think they do too. Yeah.
But they cannot to agree in.
They want to do it different ways.
Exactly, but
Right.
because he said that is your problem, and they say no, but that is your problem if you do that. So hope we can do it without harm the poor of the society, but in the same time to improve that, so to fix it.
Right. Well, and right, that's a good point. And none of the things that I'm talking about, by the way, are just 100% bad and it's evil and we have to get rid of capitalism, right? Or we have to 100% get rid of the Enlightenment. Nope. The idea is, how do you transform? And that's an interesting idea of because isn't a lot of the reason why we have emissions as high as they are is because of the international food commerce and the way that we don't eat things that are grown in our area. They come to us from thousands of miles sometimes before they arrive here, and it would actually be in some ways a chance to open a market if somebody said, yeah, actually now more people are going to have to be employed locally and in your economy because the food can't come from that far anymore.
Well, and then you're only eating food that's right now, like that's in season now. You're not going to get to eat the apples in the springtime because we're not bringing them in from,
Yeah.
So that would be very interesting to do.
That would be interesting.
To just, eat from where you live.
The next one it talks about, there's 7 of these, so they get increasingly, as you see the way that they layer upon one another, you start to say, ooh man, there's a lot to unpack here, is American individualism. So one of the things that makes it really tough for anybody to pass laws or to think about this as a communal thing is essentially also that America has a myth at its core that is around the self-made man, which sometimes we take to comedic levels and we talk about the politicians who believe that he was born in the log cabin that he built for himself, or even the notion of pulling self up by one's own bootstraps, if you've ever heard that saying, was initially it was derisive. It was meant to be comedic because you can't pull on a person's bootstraps and lift yourself up. Your boots, they're attached to the ground, But nevertheless, we believe very strongly about individualism and saying that, hey, you can't tell me what to do with my life around these things because it's my own to live. And this is particular and very peculiar to the American context. Other places have totally different notions of what individualism looks like. You can't have the same discussion that we're having today and relate it to China, because they have a very different notion of where the individual is located. And it's actually okay that we have different balances with this, but there might be times in which we have to give up a little bit of our own individual freedoms because the common good requires it. But around all of these things, again, as we're seeing them built, is number 5, uncritical patriotism. So a lot of individualism, a lot of consumerism, a lot of these things all wrapped up in just basically what it is to be an American. And that has a way of shutting down debate. We in America have been founded by a group of people who really thought that God brought them here and that this was going to be the Holy Land, that it was going to be set apart in a particular way for the Puritans to exist and thrive and bring about God's order here. And they saw themselves as priests in that. And really, ever since then, we've been pretty thrilled with ourselves here and have seen our successes as signs of God's will, as with our soldiers, as agents of God's will in the world, sometimes even. And again, what's unfortunate about that is that once we reach problems that require consensus, especially global consensus, that we come to the world with this really, really vast sense of American exceptionalism, that we are special in a special way. It's enormously unhelpful. And it's been one of the issues, I think, that evangelicals haven't fought hard enough against, if they haven't actually embodied it more or less. It's also been one of the reasons why we are one of the most problematic voices at the negotiating table when it comes to global climate change, is that we seem to believe that we're special in a special way. And what's interesting here, the next one, 6, neglect of the biblical doctrine of creation. I have read and watched a lot of lectures in preparation for this, trying to see things from the side that is anti-Christian environmentalism. And they all, to a person, start with exactly the same Bible story. They start with creation in Genesis 1, and that man was put there and was given dominion over the world, right? Some of them use different terms for dominion. They try to make it modernist. They'll say, oh, this is what it looks like to be a viceroy of the world. Sort of when the king's gone, the viceroy's in charge. Stewardship, the word of steward comes from this message too. That's where they locate this, and then they're done. That's the last piece of Bible you'll hear from them. It's as if literally all the Bible has to say about creation was that it was created. And that's absurd. The Bible is absolutely filled with talk of the natural world and creation. Creation is talked about as an ongoing thing that God enters into multiple times. Paul is all about creation. Creation groans with the childbirth that has been brought into life in Jesus Christ. All creation will be brought up, it said. The new heavens and the new earth. Isaiah, like we read today, has a vision that is apocalyptic and grand, but that literally all of nature and creation is restructured. These are vast promises that are founded, and it's evidently our duty to steward the world as it changes into a place of justice and peace. That is really neglected, and it's quite a shame, because it seems to me that there's a lot more that we could do to use the Bible to talk about all this. It's interesting too that other parts of Jewish worship. Remember Rabbi Meyer telling me this, because every single Jewish holiday has 2 components to it. It has a component of the people or a fellowship, and it has a component of nature. Every single one they do has something like that. And even the Sabbath as it's celebrated is a celebration of the created order. The celebration of Passover isn't just a celebration of being led forth out of slavery, out of a mode of human being, but into something, into a land, into a place, and into an ecology. And in that story, they hear about how God provided for them even in desolate places, and that God was a part of restoring by sending manna and quail into places that were inhospitable. That has been completely lost and unfortunately in our modern church movement, and I think it's a shame.
Also in the Old Testament, when you read the Torah, they say you have to work with this land that certain time of year, and after that you have to wait for 1 year to rest that. And in Proverbs also said you have to take care of the animal. You don't have to hit them or something like that.
And it's crazy to think that in the ancient world, Judaism must have been the absolute outlier for having animal rights as one of their topics. And also important that included in those agricultural rules was also justice for the poor. So all these things sit alongside one another. Care for creation, for the soil, for the poor who live there, for the resident alien. This is all tied up together in one vast system.
Yeah, James? No, you?
Yeah. The other James, the better James. Yeah.
He said in the chapter 1, I think, and he said, "What is the true religion? If you believe you are religion, the true religion is take care of the poor and the people who more need in this time. That was the orphan,
The widow.
and the woman without husband.
Yeah, the widow. Yeah.
The widow. I
Yep.
That's the word. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like we like Bible can have all this that you are talking about, that about the environment and
Yeah.
also the poor. That's the more important is, I think, the
That
poor.
should be a tattoo.
Well, so good. That's a good lead-in, because then you have to ask the question of, if all these things are in the Bible, and they feel central, they're central parts of what it is to be a Christian. Why is that not at the core of the belief? And now we finally get to the last one, which is premillennial dispensationalism. So we've arrived at an evangelical church that believes in radical individualism. So it's really about you and your relationship one-on-one with God. That also believes that the market is the holy thing, and all of this is wrapped up then in the sense of the rapture, of their deep and abiding belief that soon and very soon there is going to be a cataclysmic battle that destroys all of creation, and that will result in their spirits going to a different place. So we can see how from the very, very beginning we started talking about Greek philosophy and matter and spirit being different, all of these layers built on top of one another, until finally a theological paradigm was developed in the minds of these folks that basically says, who cares if Earth burns? Which is kind of crazy, because our belief is, as I said, completely different. We believe in resurrection. We believe that Christ can reorder and can resurrect the matter of this place so that it is good. And we don't get a free pass, right? We don't just punch our ticket and get out of here when we're done. This is our world.
We have to promote the kingdom of God here in the earth. So we promote that and we try to improve everything. The kingdom of God is not more close than here, but it's like we can experiment it maybe in some way the more quality of life, because the kingdom of God is
absolutely. And we say that we call that the inbreaking of God too. And that is helpful. That's helpful in faith and in hope. Because if you believe that God is a good God and that there is hope for you, then it has to be nurtured with signs. There have to be people who say, I care about you, and I choose to make your community a better place. And if you don't, then I think it's really easy to slip into despair, where people say, I don't know if there's any hope for me, for my community, or for my world. And I'm afraid that we've reached a spot now where a lot of people, especially young people, have succumbed to especially climate despair. They are just so deeply anxious about what is going to happen to their world, and have been listening to the scientists and watching the inaction of their leaders and sometimes even their parents, and have just said, I give up. It's hopeless. That for me ultimately is the enemy of faith, is hopelessness. That there's nothing left to even hope for. There's nothing left to have faith in. And ultimately it's at those moments of hopelessness when I think that Christ has to be spoken into existence, where Christ brings hope and healing, and the possibility of a way forward, because we've already seen that a cross didn't stop God. And perhaps there's a way that Christ will empower us forward in this too. But certainly not without us being willing to experience the transformation of Christ. Because it's not just that the cross exists as something that we, again, are consumers, we just purchase or then you own. The cross is a journey. It's something that takes lives and alters them. It takes communities and alters them. And it's clear to me now from the world that that's what's going to need to have happen. Any questions before we go any further?
No.
Maybe you have a commentary
Yeah, go ahead.
about the brothers that they are dispensationalists.
Yeah.
For more of experience, I don't know, but I think there are a lot of churches and they believe that back in my country for
Mm-hmm.
say something, and they really are good people,
Mm-hmm.
and they really preach the gospel, and sometimes mostly these Pentecostal churches are really full of people that really believe in God, and they always try to help everyone.
Yeah.
Try to help the poor people when they go to the jail, and they really transform life from the bad people from the jail and new people. Or sometimes I don't know. There are a father. He drink a lot, and he don't take care about their daughter and her boys, but he believes in the gospel, and he changed entirely. Yeah? But the problem I think maybe is that many of these church, but it's not a problem of really of them. The problem is they are not like academic preparation for the leader because they are poor. So they open a new new church with the same people that is poor in this church, but so they doesn't have this view that maybe we know here.
Yeah.
And they only know that the dispensationalism is how that will work in the future.
Yeah.
And all this stuff. So in my opinion, it's like a little complicated to say. They maybe in USA, yes, because USA is different, but in a global view in different countries in Latin America, maybe in Africa, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's popular. At least in Latin America, it's really popular about dispensationalism. They are trying to be good Christians, and they believe that, but
Yeah.
they don't have more knowledge.
It's a very good reminder, and that's why I try to talk in terms of systems as opposed to people. You know, I think it makes you a bad person to believe in this. Premillennial dispensationalism is an American invention, and it's been exported from here, and it's been packaged. And I think that if you want to do the right thing, you don't export that belief because it's troubling. But I understand that people who, like I say, who believe in those things can still be good people. The problem is that it does lead us to act in a certain way in the world that's unhelpful. So we have to challenge those ideas whenever we possibly can. As a result, I think that's my take. While understanding that the good people are on both sides of that. The Orthodox Church, by the way, has a completely different take on this, which I found absolutely fascinating and maybe can be helpful to the way we think about this. The Orthodox Church has maintained that creation is the third pole in a relationship between God and humanity. There's also creation. We live in creation. Creation acts upon us. God created both us and creation. And we each have separate and mutual relationships with one another. They basically reject entirely this dynamic of what the left and the right's talking about. They say no, the creation is not an object for us to dismantle or a good to consume, but neither is it God in its entirety. It obviously is a thing unto itself. They said that the proper way to think about it is this, that God has given all of us a royal priesthood, and God has created for us a holy cathedral. and that each and every one of us are worshiping priests who are called to look after the altar, to tend to the waters of baptism, to care for all of creation as if it was a church and a sacramental ground. Not that it is God itself, but that it is a place where God is to be worshipped. So therefore, it's a church. And I think that's pretty cool. That's a pretty cool notion. Fundamentally, though, I think like this guy here, Snyder, talks about, he really does locate, and I think this is important, the notion of our duty to creation in the gospel. When we hear that creation is going to be made new, it's not just that we have a job to do. That's kind of the problem with whenever we stop talking after actually Genesis 3 as opposed to Genesis 1, right? Genesis 3 is when the command of care is given. Then we just think that like I say, it's the law. There's lots of laws. We have lots of things we're supposed to do. We were just talking about which ones are not supposed to be followed anymore as Christians from the Old Testament and which ones are. Okay? Well, if that's an open-ended question that is still thought about by Christians, then the law doesn't have a very strong footing to work from. Some things we do, some things we don't. We'll get to it when we can. And also, the law doesn't save us. It doesn't justify us. So we're not like massively motivated to take care of all the things that are in there. If, however, we see that creation is a part of the package of salvation, then I think our duty changes quite a bit. It is the way that evangelicals look at the world in terms of their deep and abiding desire to save souls, which they are good at. They are deeply committed to looking for people who are caught in addiction, or who are just not aware of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they're relentless in bringing that to people in a way that the mainline church ought to have said, hey, maybe we should have taken it as seriously as they took it. But what if instead of being that relentless about individual souls, we were that relentless about all of creation, corporate creation, together as a subject, not just an object to be looked at, but all of everything together? What if we were that relentless in our pursuit for the restoration of all creation? Because we thought that was a condition for the justification of the world, that Christ sends us forth to make disciples, not just of the nations, but of all creation. Well, then I think we might get a little closer to having the will to do some of the things that are required for our world. And I hope that we get there in time too, because the rest of what Snyder talks about after this in this awesome article, and as he goes through all this, is to talk about the challenges facing the world. And then it gets pretty dismal, right? He talks about everything from deforestation to what else here? The ocean acidification. Have you heard of this one before? Where like
the rainwater?
That's where it's like the bleaching of the coral reefs, and like how if it continues at its pace, we'll have like a 70% less diverse ocean. I don't know if you've heard this one too. The Gulf Coast Current. There's like this conveyor belt that goes through the world of cold water and warm water, where geothermal vents in the Atlantic start this process, goes up towards Norway and then down. That current is one of the reasons why we have a stable atmosphere and breathable air, and it's rapidly, the temperature change of just a few degrees can upset that entire current. And of course, the interesting thing is that has Earth gone through these periods before? Well, absolutely, right? What happens is everyone dies. So
No, it makes sense.
that's the danger. Ultimately, is that while people, maybe a species survives, ultimately what would happen would be unjust. It would be the result of a sin that would hurt other people. That's what we need to think about it this way. Harming creation might ultimately result in a sin against creation so grievous that we pay for it at a grand scale. Anyway, so the moment is now. That's all I have to say about that.
Is there any truth to or worth diving into? It seems like every generation there is a doomsday, if you will, or
Yep.
this is what's going to get us. This is what's going to get us. This is what's going to get us, and not taking lightly any of those predictions, because I think all of them could have gotten us. But is there any reason why we can't, when we talk to young kids about this stuff, that we can't kind of bring that into it? There's always something that we've been afraid of that's going to get us that never happened.
Yeah.
Because, and I'm not saying that the environment is not worth to be worried about, but to your point, the kids are way more anxious nowadays, and they are in this cycle of 24/7 news, and they sit and listen to politics at the dinner table, and it may be more scary than it needs to be.
Yeah. If you didn't hear that online, the question is, if I could summarize somewhat, is around the anxiety of young people, especially as it pertains to climate. And maybe if I could summarize, what you're asking is, what level is helpful and what level is beyond that?
Yeah.
I guess I set the marker of anxiety. That's helpfulness actually is the word that I would use. As soon as your anxiety becomes a thing that is paralyzing, when like sometimes you have that flight reaction and your reaction is neither. I'm just like stuck here and I can't do anything. That ultimately is too much anxiety. That's too much fear. If it is something that motivates us to action and to change our ways and wakes us up, the way that a conscience wakes us up from our sin, then it's a good thing.
I think at some point, but if you get to the point where you're anxious, then it's too late. Like, you don't want to get to that point.
Well, anxiety is a scale, though.
Yeah.
There's low anxiety where it's just enough to make you uneasy enough to say, I got to do something about this. Right. There's also, like I say, high anxiety that's crippling. And you are right, though, too, to have a little bit of context, I think, helps for people. There actually have been a couple of things that looked totally devastating that humanity has averted. Oh man, I'm not going to get this story right, but there's a famous scientist who it's this guy. I think it's the same guy who invented the chemical that was used in the death camps in World War II. He also before then invented a soil supplement that basically saved everybody. It this nitrogenized soil supplement that allowed for I'm going to get this story wrong, so I should just stop speaking. But there actually have been moments in our history where we came up to the brink. What's different about this one is that we haven't been taking climate change seriously enough for its complexity, which is why it is such a big thing. I saw a really great comic the other day that was like environmentalism in the 80s, and it said it was this little it was a father speaking to a son, and it's the same image for all four frames. And in the 80s, he says, if you recycle enough, you can save the planet. And then in the 1990s, he's telling his son, if you ride your bike a little more often to work, or instead of taking the bus, you can save the planet. And then in the early 2000s, it says, if we can all stop using fossil fuels, we can save the planet. And the last one, he says, if we completely restructure our government and move away from various forms of, maybe we can still save a remnant of humanity, and the world's on fire behind him. Yeah. But it is that sense that it's all tied together in a massive web, and we can't we can't deal with it in part. Also, sometimes our thinking about these things and thinking about the end and the catastrophe has been helpful. It's provided people with an imagination for how to fix those problems. Famously, I mean, the Bible is full actually of people. The prophets' jobs literally was to be imaginative about disaster, right? And they spoke to the people saying, I wonder if maybe the Babylonians are going to kill us all if you continue to do this. And lo and behold, oftentimes it's happened. But Jonah is the example of a prophet who preaches destruction, and the people repent. And in that case, no destruction befalls anyone. Similarly, in modern era, some of the prophets have been science fiction writers. And here's like Isaac Asimov, right? He writes stories about robots. And now we're all kind of worried about robots. Frankly, these days, we're worried about robots taking our jobs. We're worried about the military employing robots. Well, one of the things that Isaac Asimov gave us, actually, was an imagination and a set of rules that he believed would be good to program robots with. And his rules of robotics, while they probably aren't going to be used in their full sense, do give us a framework for, hey, I wonder if we could actually avert some of the catastrophe that would come from this if we implement these 3 simple laws into any robot we build. And I can almost remember what they are. It's like a robot shall not harm a human being. A robot shall not through action or inaction bring any harm upon itself unless it conflicts with the first law. Mm-hmm. And there's like another third one. Basically, it's all designed to keep it from being a harming machine. Well, in any event, I think this has been an interesting thing to do some research into and to go more in depth about. Certainly it's timely because we have been called, I think, to think in a new and different way about the environment. The old way wasn't working and it wasn't biblical. And to find that there is, at this moment, hope, a good sign. I actually also think that it is good for the world to hear Christ preached in that moment too. For too long, we haven't had a compelling reason, evidently, for modern Americans to come to church or for them to think that we've got any sort of interesting part to play in the world. And if now we take up the mantle and say that we believe that through the transformative nature of the cross, we might make this creation a livable, just place for all people, maybe we gain relevance again, because certainly the problem has gained relevance. Everybody at their dinner table is talking about this. If Christ can be at the center of the solution, then praise be to God. Amen. Okay, Amen. I will see you guys in the new year. Thanks. This has been another session of In Depth. I don't know what we're going to talk about in the new year. We'll have to find out what that's going to be. We'll see what's happening. All right. Have a good one.